You're good on this Friday. For those who were able to go to the deep learning in Dava, it seems we are still recovering from that week. Just for FYI, for people who don't know, the deep learning in Dava is the annual AI meeting on the African continent. And for this year, it was in Ghana from the 2nd to the 9th of September. So it seems many people on the continent are still in a recovery mode after that almost 7 days of conferencing and workshops and those types of things. And as normal, just FYI in terms of for everybody, we have this Data Science for Society 7-hour webinar series in the second half of the year. It's hosted by us at the Data Science for Social Impact Research Group at the University of Pretoria, but it's open to anybody, and that's why we've moved this to this format online. We do work to record these so that people can watch them later on. And it's been a really great experience over the last couple of years, and really getting both a mix of African researchers or researchers also in lots of different continents, being able to talk about the work that they do and how it fits in really to the broader aspects of thinking about data science and AI at the moment. So thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to have Aliya and Gabriel, who will be talking to us. There's Aliya, thanks, and then Gabriel. Aliya is a policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology, free expression team, which works to promote users' free expression rights in the US and around the world. And she works on issues regarding online safety and content moderation, and is dedicated to upholding media freedom and creative expression online. Gabriel Nicholas is a research fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where his research focuses on automated content moderation and data governance. He's also a joint fellow at NYU School of Law, Information Law Institute, and the NYU Center for Cybersecurity. He has a background as a software engineer and a master's in information and management systems. I think with that, I will hand it over to Aliya and Gabriel. As in the past, just for people who've come to this for the first time, they will talk, and then you can note down your questions or add them in the chat. And then once they're done, we'll do a Q&A so that we can then ask them questions. So thank you, Aliya and Gabriel. And it's over to you.
Hey, everyone. So we'll just pull up our slides really quickly. But yeah, super excited to be here. Pleasure to talk to so many of you. And thank you so much, Vikosi, for the opportunity. As he said, my name is Aliya Bhatia. I'm a policy analyst at Center for Democracy and Technology. CDT, for short, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization based in the US. But we also have a sort of like small but mighty team in the EU working on all things Digital Services Act and more across the European continent. And then many of our team members are also involved in the conversation around the world to protect encryption, to advance sort of technical knowledge in a lot of policy and multilateral conversations. And this work really fits into that key sort of way we think about promoting democratic values and rights in the digital age. We see ourselves, especially with research fellows like Gabe, to sort of advance more understanding of the technical systems that sort of underpin the internet into these policy conversations. So we want to sort of complicate the notions or sort of advance more technical literacy in the policy conversations. So this paper, this research project really is a continuation of something that CDT has long done, which is explain and really do a deep dive into some of the automated content analysis systems that are used to host and analyze speech on the internet. And just before I sort of really dive in, I just want to say we're really excited to have the sort of discussion section, to jump into the discussion section of today's meeting. And, in particular, we would love to hear about your research, and if, you are building any of these tools or looking into any of these tools, particularly in African or other languages, we'd love to hear about some of the challenges, opportunities you're facing, and anything part of your process. We are also still learning a lot about this and would love to hear about your experiences. So as mentioned, this work is sort of in continuation of a large work stream at CDT, where we've been looking into the opportunities and challenges of automated content analysis systems. And in particular, we began our research trying to understand how are large, social media companies and other online service providers better serving their users who speak different languages. How do they host and analyze speech across different languages at the scale that they do work in? Gabe, we can go to the next slide. And as we started doing a really broad and cursory search of this, we started seeing increasingly bold claims made by some of the world's largest companies about these new language models that purported to understand tens, hundreds, and even thousands of the world's most spoken languages. So that was, a really, that was sort of concurrent to our research phase, where we were finding these bold claims by these companies. And we wanted to understand what were these language models that they were using, how they worked, and how they actually built those associations across languages. Next slide. These are some of the claims that and new advancements that companies were, publishing and announcing. Meta, for example, with their XLMR tool, but also others, we're talking about the potential to detect harmful content quickly across languages, and do so with sort of little examples of text. And similarly, Perspective is a tool used by Google's Jigsaw, or developed by Google's Jigsaw, that is really undergirding infrastructure for a lot of researchers, but also other deployers of technology to sort of either detect or analyze or reduce toxicity online. Perspective is also used for sentiment analysis. And they were also saying that we could use similar language model tools that are powering chatbots and ChatGPT, the whole chatbot hype, but they could be used for content analysis as well as content generation, and do so in a really sophisticated way. So we wanted to understand, okay, what is the utility of these language models? How do they work across languages? And how could we sort of not only understand this ourselves and participate in the technical conversation, but also explain it to folks who for a long time have been calling on companies to either apply content policies equitably across languages, or sort of dispel the sort of technology that they're using across different languages. Next slide. So here are some of the sort of deep claims that they're making, that not only can these tools work across languages, but they can also adapt quickly to sort of apply rules or detect newer forms of harmful content, do so with sort of little to no examples of that text in those languages, or those examples of harmful content. And the range of languages is also super interesting. Yeah. As we start diving into this sort of questions of how are companies doing this, and how do these tools work, we also are hitting a concurrent sort of blocker / mode of inquiry or area of inquiry that I'm sure many of you are very aware of, which is, how are companies building these tools given the lack of available training resources across languages? So we were finding that English, as many of you know, is just the predominant language both on the internet, but also represented in sort of training data, training resources. And whereas a lot of different languages, particularly those spoken in the global South and the majority world, are what NLP researchers considered extremely low resource or low resource languages. So, some of the most widely spoken languages like Arabic, French, Spanish were considered relatively high resource. They had, a wide number of speakers, and a number of training data, training resources available for them. But a number of the other languages had, few high quality examples of this types of text, and the available sort of examples of that text, labeled training data, was either from parliamentary proceedings, or was machine translated, or was, the errant Wikipedia page that was available in those languages. So a concurrent question that we were asking as we were continuing this research was, not only how are companies building these tools, but how are they building it given that there isn't a lot of examples to train these models, yet the companies still argue that they have gained a pretty sophisticated understanding of and capabilities across hundreds of languages, thousands of languages. And in particular, a lot of these tools, or a lot of these companies were touting the ability for these language models to understand or learn patterns in these languages without seeing requisite examples or enough examples of the language itself. So we wanted to understand how that happened. Next. And this is also just not only is English just the most widely spoken language, or widely sort of available language in terms of training resources, but also it is the most studied language, which I'm sure many of you have sort of encountered in the NLP space, which was also skewing sort of the attention placed on capabilities of these language models or performance of language models in these other languages. Not only was there not a lot of training data resources created, but the sort of area of research was also predominantly focused on English, which means it was creating this like sort of vicious cycle of fewer training data resources available, fewer evaluation benchmarks and evaluation data sets available, and fewer, just less attention placed on capabilities and performance of these models in different languages, which was creating just like promoting further Anglocentrism. And I also want to say that this is a sort of I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but it's a sort of vicious cycle, but it has sort of two modes of more English attention. One is that obviously the internet, the history of the internet has just advanced English because of the predominance and hegemony of a lot of these American technology companies. But also because of just like the preponderance of sort of English, British colonialism and the remnants of it, and also just how many of our countries have continued producing or placing more prominence on producing English language text on the internet and elsewhere. So even a lot of researchers that are working in different languages were publishing English papers, were sort of continuing in this like English environment. So that's resulted further that's changing, I believe. I think a lot of researchers are now creating their own training data sets and publishing a lot of their findings in different languages. But it's this like vicious cycle that just keeps us going into this like English first space. Next slide. So these were some of the questions that, yes. So, feel free to use the chat. We won't totally get distracted by it, but, these are examples of the sort of short, when we say, what are the implications of an Anglo-centric model or predominant attention on English, we are talking about models that will fall short in different languages, and those sort of errors could have an impact from anywhere to sort of comical, mistranslations of text to outright sort of misinterpretations of text, which could lead to, in this case, an arrest. In other cases, these language models may be used in sort of decision-making tools. And so what does that do to economic opportunity, safety, et cetera? And so those are the sort of questions we were asking. We wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, understand what are these multilingual language models? How do they work? How effective are they? What are the shortcomings? And what do those shortcomings means? What do they mean for individuals' rights? At CDT, we're thinking about, not only human rights, so right to free expression, privacy, and freedom from non-discrimination, but also a lot of economic and cultural and social rights. And then also, what are the ways we can improve these systems, particularly in low resource languages? I'll hand it over to Gabe, and yeah.
Great. Thanks, Aliya. So as Aliya was saying, we were very interested in sort of like not only are some of the what are some of the shortcomings of these multilingual language models, but where are the promises that folks who are deploying these language models at odds with the kind of performance that we're seeing in the real world. This is a little bit hard to judge right now because we are still in the early stage of folks using and deploying multilingual language models. One of the main places where we end up seeing it is from social media companies. Meta, Google, and Bumble have each have blog posts about the ways in which they use multilingual language models to do automated content moderation on their platforms. There's other rumblings that we've heard in the US about governments using these language models to translate or otherwise evaluate refugee status applications. And so you'll notice in sort of the rest of this presentation, we will kind of be going back, and there will be, we are talking generally about different content analysis processes, but you'll hear a focus on social media companies, in part just because that's one of the big things that we're interested in at CDT, but in part that is because like that currently is one of the at least most public-facing use cases that we're seeing for these multilingual language model content analysis systems. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick technical overview, which I do not think, this is a very intimidating group to give that technical overview to, since I'm sure many of you are aware of this information or more aware of it than me. Okay, so I want to quickly just talk about what the idea of this is a brief chart that is about the idea of a language model, which essentially shows that language models are models that capture statistical relations in language and can draw individual relationships between words and phrases kind of based on the frequency with which they appear in training data. And what multilingual language models do is that they create these connections across different languages, right? They're language models that are trained on many different languages, and sometimes either they infer the connections between different languages, or they are explicitly trained on bytext to make those, in order to better make those connections. And what we end up seeing a lot is companies end up using these multilingual language models for content moderation and content analysis. There's a couple of different ways that we've seen that in the academic literature. Sometimes researchers who are trying to build a language model that can detect harmful content in French or Arabic or whatever, they sometimes may fine-tune their own monolingual model. They'll sometimes take a multilingual language model and fine-tune that on a specific language that they're looking to detect content in. Also, a lot of times in research that we've seen from companies, we see a lot of promises about using few and zero-shot learning in order to enforce content policies. There's a paper that came out from Meta maybe 2 or 3 years ago, where they were very much excited about their capabilities to provide, I think it was maybe 8 examples of different types of harmful content, and using those, it was a few-shot learning thing where they would basically use those examples to extrapolate and say, like, okay, model is learned to identify this type of harmful content from only these 8 examples, or from these, or even just from a description of the policy. And the last thing that we kind of see, which we don't necessarily know how much it's getting deployed, but is something that seems to be getting a lot of research attention, is zero-shot cross-lingual transfer, where essentially a company will show an example of harmful text in one high-resource language, usually English, and leverage the multilingual language model's connections across languages to detect that same type of content in other languages, particularly languages for which it has less data. And when we see companies talking about these language models, we see a lot of rhetoric that sort of collapses the capabilities between high resource languages and low resource languages, right? Bumble will say their model works in 15 languages. Meta will say XLMR allows them to detect harmful content in 100, 200 languages. And one of the concerns that we have is that this sort of binary language around work ends up collapsing a lot of the differences that exist between how well these language models work in higher resource languages and how well these languages models work in lower resource languages. Particularly, I'm going to pass over that slide briefly, but one of the big things that we see, and actually in a lot of our review of NLP literature, is that there is a lot of promise about how well multilingual language models can work in maybe simpler semantic and syntactic tasks. But when it comes to higher order, more language and context-specific tasks, that's where these models can very often fall short, right? And part of why this seems to be is because if a language model is leveraging, if a language model's performance in a lower resource language comes from its connections that it's making through higher resource languages like English, then that context is not, there may be some basic semantic and syntactic structures that are more able to transfer across languages, but otherwise, then you end up mapping this English language context onto these non-English language scenarios, and models end up kind of performing worse then. There's some literature that we found to support this. We can more happily talk about later. But in general, we found sort of three main limitations when it comes to how well multilingual language models work. First of all, this issue here where multilingual language models end up importing assumptions from English into other languages. When you look at the ratio of how much these multilingual language models are trained on English versus other languages, I think Bloom is probably the model with the most even amount of data. Even that, I think, is something 40, close to 50% English data. But many of these other multilingual language models, Ember, XLMR, GPT-3 claims to be multilingual in some ways. We have no idea about the data underlying GPT-4. Can be 80, 90, 95% English data. Another issue that we have seen a lot is that multilingual language models over-rely on text that over-rely on either machine translated or otherwise non-representative text. I imagine many of you have faced these issues directly. But there is a lot of work about how, for instance, web scraped data can vary very widely in quality, especially in lower resource languages. It's much more likely to be mislabeled. It's much more likely to be mistranslated and therefore not reflect how real speakers use language. It's more likely to contain offensive material or pornography. And when it is not coming from internet scraped data, it is much more likely to be about sort of a less wider, diverse range of topics, right? So it'll often be government work. It'll often be the Bible, for instance. And again, these language models end up having a limited concept of language, especially in these lower resource languages, because that text does not end up being representative. And then finally, these multilingual language models cannot and do not work equally well in all languages. This is a problem that NLP folks call the curse of multilinguality, which is essentially the more languages you end up teaching a model, the less it is able to capture idiosyncrasies across languages, right? And similarly, there's a lot of work that says if you improve how well a language model works in one language, you will reduce how well it ends up working in etymologically distinct languages from that, right? So improve how well a language model works in Serbo-Croatian, and you will end up hurting that multilingual language model's ability to also work in Amharic. And this kind of ends up creating a zero-sum trade-off that we do not hear companies who are deploying these language models talking about. There are sort of very real fairness and equity concerns about to what extent which languages should a given language model prioritize, right? And if you're a social media company, how do you make those decisions? Do you make them based on the number of speakers? Do you make them based on how like the danger of what happens if speech ends up getting mislabeled? Sort of like, what are the right ways to sort of fairly allocate those different performance capabilities, assuming it's a limited resource? And this is something that we sort of not only don't see companies talking about how they go through that, but we also don't see even larger acknowledgement that these zero-sum trade-offs might be a concern. And there's many ways in which there are concerns. Some things are how much parameter space gets allocated per language. There's other questions about vocabulary, right? To what extent which languages are getting full words versus subwords versus letters versus not having their orthographies represented. And the larger a model's vocabulary it is, in general, the slower it'll work. So companies end up making a lot of trade-offs around performance and multilinguality and trade-offs between languages. And a big part of this work was for us to say, look, these trade-offs are very real, and just because they're not getting discussed does not mean that they are not happening. Okay, so I am turning it back to you to talk about these recommendations? Great.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Gabe. So given a lot of the shortcomings that we found in the paper that Gabe just walked through, and also opportunities for more information from companies developing and deploying these tools, I think our first sort of bucket of recommendations was around transparency and disclosure, both to advance research, but also to ensure that users affected by these tools or encountering these tools have access to remedy, or at least access to informed consent. They should know when these models are being deployed and which languages. Sort of like, to take a extremely zoomed out step back, I think one of the maybe least problematic outcomes, but also more like most permeating outcomes of a lot of these tools, is that it leads to like a sort of perception gap or distrust with users who, seeing a mistranslation or misinterpretation of their language, will immediately assume that a system doesn't understand its languages. And that sort of distrust or perception that these models don't work in a certain language has long sort of resulted in users circumventing automated content tools, or sort of perceiving these social media companies or other companies as just not for them, and has resulted in a lot of sort of degradation of rights or degradation of use of these tools. And so we think sort of transparency and disclosure about when companies are deploying these language models and in which languages sort of builds that sort of trust gap again with the user and with the affected sort of language speaker. And it also promotes, as I mentioned, further research. Gabe noted that, since companies are not really, we don't really know where these models are being used just yet, I think it helps us sort of like make that sort of direct one-to-one correlation or sort of association when the model is being used, and then potential shortcomings of them when we know where they're actually being used and in which languages. The second sort of bucket of recommendations is that, because of this resourcedness gap, right? Because all languages are not documented equally, because there isn't enough training data or training resources available across languages, particularly in sort of languages spoken in the majority world and global South. Because that sort of leads to a lot of lower performance in these low resource languages, we think that there needs to be a lot more language resource development, and communities like Masakane NLP that Vicosi's obviously founded, and LLaMa, as well as a lot of different groups like Indo NLP, which is focused on the documentation of the languages spoken in the Indonesian area. America's NLP, that's looking at indigenous languages. We think these groups should be at the forefront of sort of advancing language resourcedness this. These are communities that these are, researchers like many of you, I'm sure, on the call, that are acquainted with, some of the specific gaps that exist in terms of language resourcing, understanding how best to represent the language in training resources. And I think these NLP communities can also be at the forefront of advancing that virtuous cycle of development, of performance, and of research into these language. So a lot of our paper sort of funnels resources and sort of is just point blank saying that like companies and different funding bodies should directly find these groups and fund them, because they are at the forefront of not only filling that resourcefulness gap, but also understanding where there may need to be more research, and how maybe even to sort of think about that curse of multilinguality, right? Like, how do we actually weigh the different languages? Should we? And what are the best how can models be tuned into these different languages? And then third, because of the shortcomings that we sort of highlight in this paper, we think that they're just not up to scuff yet, in terms of making high stakes decisions. We think that because these models do fall short in parsing specifically low resource languages and languages spoken by many people seeking asylum or other benefits, that these models should not be used in these high stakes decisions because of their potential to fall short, and really erect barriers to safety and economic opportunities and things like that. That sort of goes hand in hand with the first recommendation, which is that when they are being used, there needs to be a lot more disclosure. Since this paper has come out, but also, as we were writing this paper, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. The research and news cycle was just, pummeling forward, and things were changing every day. And a lot of governments and, big multilateral bodies have since announced that there is a lot of interest in using language models and other AI-powered tools in benefits determinations, in making information available about the government, about healthcare, about, creating sovereign models. And we just think that if we do want to advance research in this area and fully understand the potential for these tools to be used in these areas, we need to know a lot more, and we need these models to be used, really publicly and with a lot of oversight and access to remedy. So that's sort of where this third recommendation is coming from. We really, I think, Vakosi, you have a couple of questions for us, but we'd love to hear about, thoughts, how this research sort of interacts with your research, how other research you're doing. Because I think overall, this question of non-English language performance is like a really large issue. And, I think the potential for these models to sort of collapse differences between similar languages that are syntactically similar, otherwise still can have like a sort of great impact on the way, communities sort of identify themselves or self-determination and things like that. So there are lots of like larger dignity and also equity questions around language performance, and would love to have that conversation as well. But yeah, anything else, Gabe?
I don't really think so. I guess the one thing that I'll add is that if you can't already tell, a lot of this work that Aliya and I have been doing is translational. The goal is really to talk to NLP researchers and data science researchers like you all to see the issues, to talk about the issues that you all face and the shortcomings and the challenges, especially in working in lower resource languages, and translate them for broader audiences who are not in the thick of it of the NLP world all the time. We are concerned about the rhetoric that we see that language models understand all these languages, etc. And a lot of what we want to do is sort of to help combat that rhetoric more largely, and also help others understand, if we want to improve language equity, what is the kind of research that needs to be done? What are the areas that we need, that that folks should be investing in, folks who are funders who are interested in these issues, governments that are interested in these issues? Where is it that attention really needs to be paid right now? And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can open this up to questions.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Aliya and Gabriel, on that. It was great. I'll kick it off, but I just wanted to, everybody who's on this this Zoom, you can just raise your hand. I'll acknowledge it, and then you can ask your question on there, or you can add some questions already in the text as well, and then I'll read them out for our colleagues here. I think maybe I wanted to start off with, and I'll be very interested in the thoughts, is given CDT's mission, how policymakers are responding to some of these insights. Because I think there's one part of the NLP researchers or the AI researchers working on these things, or the researchers, I think, connected to Martin's question, who work on just fighting online abuse, right? They might not be AI driven. But ultimately, we're mostly thinking about this in English. But how do policymakers then think through this process? Any thoughts in terms of your experiences and what also other people could be doing to just make this more front and center?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick that off. So the biggest sort of takeaway from this paper, and it's like sort of low hanging, is that this paper has really served as like a sort of point of validation for a lot of audiences. So in terms of NLP researchers and also human rights advocates from around the world and in the US, a lot of people feel sort of very represented by this paper. They're saying like, yeah, we all knew this. We all knew that English is getting a lot more funding dollars, a lot more research and policy attention than other languages. And so thank you for writing that. And I think policymakers also feel similarly in the US, because there has been a large conversation over the last few years. Sometimes I joke that like ahead of every election, like a handful of American policymakers will send letters to the same companies and saying like, what are you doing for election disinformation in different languages? That letter gets sent almost yearly. It gets sent the same way. And so this is like yet another citation for that, but also serves as a point of validation, because I think now policymakers have specific shortcomings that they can point to, saying not just that Google or Facebook, you're not thinking about different languages, but specifically you're not doing the requisite investment into building these training data resources to sort of further power or sort of advance the performance of your existing automated tools. So in that way, policymakers have been, happy about this paper. In the US, also, regulators are looking into, what are companies doing to combat fraud that targets different language communities. So in that respect, they also want to understand, like, what are the tools? And as Gabe said, like, we are playing a little more bit of that, like, translational role. We're saying, like, yes, you found this problem. This is how a company will tackle it. But because of this resources in this gap, like, there's still an open question about whether these tools are fitting this specific issue. So, for example, one of the things the Federal Trade Commission is looking at is like, how is fraud targeting Americans in indigenous languages? And that's incredibly hard to understand because A, we don't have full insight about how companies are doing that, but B, because any tools that are going to be deployed are going to be trained on, a really negligible amount of indigenous or of training data in indigenous languages, specifically the sophisticated ways that fraudsters are targeting folks in those languages. So from that policy perspective, it's like half validation, half translational, sort of like equipping them with the understanding. But I think globally, and I'll hand over to Gabe in this point, like globally and also in the US, a large part of this has been like narrative change, right? Like shifting the window of conversation to say, we can't, it is super myopic to have this conversation about AI and AI's potentials only in the frame of English. not, and we are pulling that argument in any way we can, right? Like from the equity perspective, from the performance perspective, from the safety and competition perspective, it is just so short-sighted to have this conversation without understanding the specific ways that, whether the opportunities of AI are going to help non-English speakers, whether the opportunities of AI are going to help non-English language researchers and AI developers, whether funding dollars are going to be spent equitably. There's just so many threads there, and we're just shifting the window of conversation. We're trying to.
The only thing I will briefly add to that is this has been a learning experience for me to realize that the currency of policymakers is specific examples, right? When we are able to highlight examples of how this issue that we are talking about has caused specific harm or specific dangers that it raises, something that sort of fits into a narrative, that is kind of where the idea is more likely to hold on to some policymakers' mind and then have them talk about it and propagate it elsewhere in the world. So I think part of what we're also trying to do at this point is gather some of those specific examples. And also, unfortunately, in the US, it ends up more often having to be specific examples that target more like language populations that are more present in the US. But like there's been a lot of lessons that I've personally learned navigating this world for the first time about just how much people grab onto those.
Okay. No, thanks for that. Martin, do you want to ask your question directly? You can unmute there. Oh, there's a Martin.
Here I am. Hello.
Yeah.
Thanks for, this has been a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion, and it's gotten me, there's so much that's happening in, or not happening actually, in African language technology because I think of AI. That at this point, it really has become impossible to get any sort of grant funding for NLP research that's not saying, okay, this is how we're going to apply AI to an African context. And that kind of works if you're talking about Swahili or a few other languages, but as soon as you move outside of the data availability, as you're saying, it really becomes not a hit or miss prospect, but just a miss prospect. But I also am thinking you might be giving too much credence to how successful AI or large language models are in English. We see that they're doing a lot of great stuff, interesting stuff, but they hit a wall really, really quickly. And I just wanted to read from something from Bard. I posted to Bard the question, find me some doppelgangers, Jews and Muslims who are doppelgangers, just for a point I was trying to make. I was looking for photos, and Bard came back with, there is no scientific evidence to support the existence of doppelgangers. And then Bard said, the idea that Jews and Muslims look alike is a harmful stereotype that should be challenged. And so this is English. And this is the height of, of general artificial intelligence in English. So where can we, if this is the best that we're getting from them now, what does this imply for other languages and also for what we try to do, even if we're using English, as you say, the dominant language, for pushing forward on the research?
So I can jump in quickly on this, which is to say that, very much agree with you here. I think there are a lot of limitations to these models that folks do not talk about. And there's sort of this interesting tension that we've seen in the, that's happening in the fact community right now of, there are folks who say these language models, are complete garbage and they don't work in anything, and why are we paying all this attention to them? And then there's these other people who are saying these language models are basically human and they can do anything a person can, and like we need to grapple with this new reality. And I think there is something, and that middle ground is probably closer to reality and very difficult to talk about, right? Because there are a lot of these things that these language models can do very well. And I think there's also a lot of tasks that like once a model is fine-tuned more for a specific task, right? Rather than just like it's the more general chatbot model, then I think we're also seeing sort of different kinds of outcomes. And in the case of content moderation, like it is true that like some of these fine-tuned language models are doing far better than any of the earlier classifiers that existed. And so like when we're talking about this, as policy folks, we have to do some acknowledgement of like these language models are better at a lot of things than they previously were. Like there are real leaps and bounds happening here, but also caveat that with like don't go too far in how well these things work. So this I think has been a real challenge for us. It's very easy to have extreme rhetoric in one way or the other. It's very hard to have like subtler, more nuanced rhetoric. And that has been, I think that is a good flag, Martin, for some of the ways that we talk about this, but this has been sort of a challenge throughout all of this work.
Okay, thanks for that. Sorry, are there any other questions from the audience? Before I go in, I can ask another question. That's okay. While people are thinking, okay. So I think one which I think we will go through maybe the report again and then get all the links inside there has been this thing of again. There's obviously almost like a thought that with languages you can just almost align them, so you can smush, like, you know, as long as you're working. If you're trying to understand kind of abuse online, that's in Swahili, just as Martin talked about, it's just you must understand abuse in English, and then you should just be able to align those two things. But then I think one of the things that you highlighted is also this challenge of thinking in English also comes with its own baggage, in the same way that thinking in Swahili does. I'm probably using the wrong word in terms of baggage, but it's that context within there. So trying to move one to the other doesn't naturally think, is that you throw away the nuance, and then all you do is you come up with this very generic thing that probably doesn't actually fit in with everything. So South Africa is having an election next year, and a couple of other African countries are about to go on this road again over the next 12 months. And I think maybe a thing I would want to get from both of you is, what are those suggestions now in dealing with the big tech companies who now are in charge of of these moderation tools and everything? Like, you know, should they be more working with local teams as opposed to just saying we'll handle this from San Francisco or wherever they are? To deal with these things, or it's just, you know, nobody really is going to spend that amount of money in spaces that they don't think they have enough customers who are paying, or whatever that comes with that. I don't know, like, that's a cynical response, obviously, but we are hoping to protect our citizens at the end of the day. But yeah, maybe it'd be interesting to get a thought on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there's like a lot of threads there. I mean, number one, it's like, yes, English assumptions do not like neatly translate or transfer over to English to other language contexts. And I think in the paper we give like very specific examples of that, where like the word, for example, uso in Basque means dove, and importing assumptions from the English language onto a different language context might result in folks thinking that dove has connotations of peace in every language, but it absolutely doesn't, especially in Basque, where uso is used as like a homophobic slur, right? So the question we're asking is more like, will companies even be able to equally apply their own content policies if they don't understand these nuances between language communities. One other thing I'd say is that even English language assumptions are not neatly transferred into different English language speaking communities, right? In India, for example, we have a lot of words that we use in English that are not used in any other community, right? Like we have words for time management, the words for tomorrow and yesterday in Hindi are the same word. It's very contextual and very cultural specific. And I think without, people, Facebook, Google obviously have like large India teams because of various reasons. But if they're not empowered to give these sort of like, if this sort of cultural context, the companies will not be sort of adequately able to apply its tools and also like look out for these different nuances. Right now, what we're seeing is, for the last few years in election cycles, we've seen like definitely one person at a company manage like election responses globally. As you sort of noted, the person in San Francisco, I'm actually worried that that's even like a step too far for the next few years. Like I think right now, a lot of companies are trying to reduce their regulatory and liability risk by saying like, actually, we're not going to have anyone working on it because even having one person or a robust team assumes that I think companies view it as like, if we do have a team, it opens that team up for liability or any sort of retaliation from a government. And so we're just going to sort of fly blind and act as if we're not going to have any people. And that's one thing that like from the policy and non-AI front, we're really trying to push against. Like, we need robust trust and safety teams. We need robust cultural context and local context to if a company is deploying these tools, and higher order goal for a paper like this is to challenge what NLP researchers and psychology researchers call like the weird, just like weird NLP, the focus of tools to be sort of Western educated, industrialized, like the attention to be placed mostly on dominant perspectives. We're trying to challenge that notion and say, no, actually, you need to talk to these people. Like, you can't be repeating the mistakes you've made multiple times because these AI tools are very sophisticated. So, I share with I share the cynicism that you have, but I actually don't think. I think sometimes it's like a very concerted decision rather than just neglect as well.
Yeah, I will add because you mentioned investing explicitly in more local content moderators. I think this is a point that we always try to make and drive home, and can also sometimes feel like hitting your head against a wall. There are some questions that I have about like organization flows within connections of information within an organization. I think there are like many countries where large social media platforms have like local folks who work on the ground, and actually those folks have connections to civil society organizations, and sometimes they will consult those civil society organizations when there is a particularly hairy content moderation problem, or those civil society organizations can say, hey, we're seeing this problem on the ground, like we have this connection at Meta or Google, whatever, FYI. There are some countries where those connections are stronger. There are some where those connections are weaker. There's larger political questions about who do you even want to have connected to these companies. But I guess I have some question about like, if companies are ingesting this information anywhere and we feel positively about it, is there any way in which those data flows are kind of going back to the original, to the moderation systems? I don't know. The other question is kind of the inverse of that, and the danger is that also a lot of these like local offices that work of social media companies that work within countries end up mostly being like government relations offices. And we'll sometimes see too close connections between like the content policy, who determines what is online, and the government relations folks. Sometimes they'll even report up to the same person. And there's a danger there of like, to what extent then are automated content moderation systems being used to enact government will in potentially, in some places, dangerous and undemocratic ways. So like there's really complicated questions about who do you want to empower in these situations and how do you want to empower them that are very like language and context specific, that we sometimes try to grapple with, but frankly we are not on the ground anywhere else enough to be able to talk about them deeply anywhere besides the US and Europe.
And sometimes those government, the teams that folks have on the ground are not even, I mean, they're like gov affairs. So they want to keep various agencies happy, but sometimes they're explicitly also like business development officers, right? Like people who report to the ultimate like profit loss of the company, which absolutely skews the incentive to apply rules equitably, and it sort of, weaponizes these tools as like, further like makes these tools just like act in service of capital or scale or whatever is the most profitable decision.
Yeah, okay. I'll try and answer and take that one on just to give context. I think you are correct in some spaces about the offices that are here. I think in a lot of developing countries, not just on the African continent, this is a challenge that you have very big tech companies or even other companies that are local, but then might be really having a lot of economic might when it comes to technology, right? Not just AI. And they tend to then obviously have this relationship that they can get cozier with governments, and then through the governments then shape the policies that are coming on there. And we see this because one of the ways you can evaluate it is for a local office of whatever tech company, in quotes there, how much of it actually is engineering, right? So how many people actually are working on the core product and building the core product versus that you have legal compliance and marketing, right? Which tends to be that for a lot of countries in the global south, that's what you have, right? It's just illegal, the marketing and the sales all this compliance stuff. And it then becomes something else that now you really have people who study how to influence policy going up against a lot of people in government who don't necessarily understand the depth of what's going on. That's another part. And this is not necessarily a problem that's in the global south. Having lived in the US and other European countries, it's the same thing. So you need to find a way to balance the scales. So one, you could have a single market like the EU that really tries to then use policy making across a huge region, and then allows you to maybe balance those scales because different expertise will come along from different spaces on there. But that is still a challenge within even the African continent. I've worked with the African Union. It's not a secret that they don't get enough funding. They don't have enough funding from member states and all those things. And it really does kneecap them. And this actually does make it an issue when it comes to things like this, where you have to come up with policy that covers these things. We've seen since the advent of GDPR for the EU, what this has meant, because it's obviously also had reverberations internationally. But now